On this back road in Lincoln County, where fog drifts down like smoke and the hills keep their secrets, 9 men vanished this fall. Locals call it the Tollett family case, but it's bigger than one family. Tonight, we retrace the trail the missing men followed and the people who say they never came back.
On the morning of November 3rd, 1990, 9 men disappeared from a 12-mile stretch of the Cumberland Plateau in eastern Kentucky. By sunset on November 5th, all 9 were dead, their bodies scattered across ravines and abandoned mine shafts in some of the most remote terrain in Appalachia. The perpetrators were the Tollett family, a father and his 4 sons, operating with the precision of a military unit and the ruthlessness of men who believed they had nothing left to lose. Kentucky State Police would later classify it as the most systematic manhunt in modern Appalachian history. But the motive wasn't drugs or organized crime or even a generations-old blood feud. It was $300,000 in Civil War gold coins that had been stolen from a hiding place known only to the Tollett patriarch, and one man's absolute conviction that some debts could only be settled with blood. Before you continue, understand this story contains graphic violence based on a dramatized account of desperation in forgotten America. If you have the courage to hear how far ordinary men will go when pushed beyond reason, leave your like and subscribe. But be warned, this is not just history. This is a mirror. Pike County, Kentucky, stretched across 488 square miles of mountains, so steep and hollows so deep that entire communities existed beyond the reach of paved roads in 1990. The Daniel Boone National Forest covered much of the county, creating vast stretches of wilderness where a man could walk for days without seeing another human being. Population stood at 68,000, but most clustered in small towns along Route 23, the country music highway. The rest lived scattered through the mountains in trailers and cabins and homesteads that had been in families since before Kentucky became a state. November in Pike County meant temperatures dropping to the mid-30s at night, climbing barely into the 50s by afternoon. The mountains blazed with autumn color, the last stubborn leaves of oak and hickory refusing to fall. Wood smoke hung thick in the hollows, from coal stoves and fireplaces, mixing with the smell of damp earth and the occasional drift of marijuana from illegal grows hidden deep in the national forest. The coal industry that had sustained the region for a century was dying its slow death, mines closing, jobs vanishing, leaving behind only black lung disease and mountains stripped bare by surface mining. By 1990, Eastern Kentucky had one of the highest unemployment rates in the nation. Young people fled to Lexington or Cincinnati or anywhere with actual job prospects. Those who remained scraped by on disability checks, welfare, under-the-table work, and in some cases, more lucrative illegal enterprises. The war on drugs had turned some hollows into armed camps where marijuana growers protected their crops with booby traps and assault rifles. Methamphetamine was beginning its devastating march through Appalachia. OxyContin would arrive within a few years to finish what economic collapse had started. This was the landscape where desperation bred choices no human being should have to make, where the line between survival and criminality blurred until it disappeared entirely, where men who'd once worked honest jobs in deep mines now had to decide between watching their families starve or crossing lines they'd been raised never to cross, and where stolen gold could mean the difference between losing everything and securing a future for grandchildren not yet born. Raymond Tollett was 72 years old that November, though the mountains had aged him beyond his years. 6 feet tall but stooped from decades underground, his hands were massive and scarred, 3 fingers on his left hand permanently bent from a roof collapse in 1963 that should have killed him. His face was weathered leather, creased deep by sun and wind and the weight of hard choices. A thick white beard covered his jaw, and his eyes, pale blue and cold as creek water in January, missed nothing. He walked with a pronounced limp, legacy of the same accident that had mangled his hand. And when weather turned cold, that limp became so severe, his youngest son had to help him down the porch steps. But age and injury hadn't diminished the essential force of Raymond Tollett's presence. When he entered a room, conversation stopped. When he spoke, people listened. not from love or even respect, but from the certain knowledge that Raymond Tollett was not a man to be crossed. Raymond had worked the coal mines from age 14 until the black lung forced him to surface at 53. 19 years underground in seams so narrow, a grown man crawled on his belly, breathing coal dust that turned his lungs to stone. His father had worked coal. His grandfather had worked coal. The Tolletts had been pulling black rock from Kentucky mountains since 1889, when Raymond's great-grandfather arrived from Wales with mining experience and a willingness to risk his life for wages that could feed a family. Raymond had married Sarah Mackenzie in 1941, right before shipping out to the Pacific. He'd survived Guadalcanal and Okinawa, come home in 1945 with shrapnel still in his leg and nightmares that never fully stopped. They'd had 4 sons, Jacob, Samuel, Ezra, and Benjamin, born between 1946 and 1954. Sarah had died of cancer in 1978, leaving Raymond alone in the house they'd built together in 1947, surrounded by photographs of a life that seemed to belong to someone else now. By 1990, all 4 sons lived within 5 miles of their father's property, working odd jobs, raising families, surviving in an economy that had abandoned them. What kept the Tollett family afloat when mines closed and jobs disappeared wasn't welfare or disability or food stamps, though they qualified for all 3. It was Raymond's inheritance. $300,000 in gold coins minted between 1861 and 1865. Payment his great-great-grandfather had received for supplying horses to Confederate forces operating in eastern Kentucky. The coins had been hidden for generations, passed from father to son with strict instructions never to sell unless the family faced true desperation. Raymond's father had shown him the hiding place in 1952, deep in an abandoned mine shaft on Tollett property, sealed behind a wall of stacked stone that looked natural unless you knew exactly where to look. 11 canvas bags, each containing coins worth a fortune to collectors and historians. Raymond had checked them twice a year for 38 years, always alone, always at dawn when no one else was awake to follow. He'd never told his sons the exact location, only that the gold existed and would be theirs when he died. Insurance against the poverty that swallowed so many Appalachian families when the coal economy collapsed. The Brennan brothers, Marcus, Thomas, Patrick, Liam, and Declan, along with their cousins, Robert, Kevin, Sean, and Michael, had arrived in Pike County in 1987 from West Virginia. Irish ancestry going back 4 generations, they'd followed the coal boom from county to county, working as contract miners, equipment operators, and eventually, when legitimate work dried up, as thieves specializing in stealing mining equipment and scrap metal. They weren't sophisticated criminals, just desperate men with mechanical skills and a willingness to take what wasn't theirs when opportunity presented. By 1990, they'd established themselves in a compound of trailers and shanties 10 miles from the Tollett property, surviving through a combination of disability fraud, copper wire theft, and occasional burglary of rural properties. They were known to local law enforcement but hard to catch, operating in remote areas where police rarely patrolled, and victims often didn't report crimes because they were engaged in illegal activities themselves. The Brennans had heard stories about Raymond Tollett's gold the way everyone in Pike County had heard them. Whispered conversations in bars, rumors passed between families who'd lived in the mountains for generations. Most people dismissed the stories as legend, the kind of treasure tale every rural area accumulated over centuries. Confederate gold hidden in caves, Civil War payrolls buried and never recovered, fortunes in coins stashed by paranoid ancestors and lost when the location died with them. 99% of these stories were fantasy, wishful thinking by poor people dreaming of sudden wealth. But Marcus Brennan, the oldest brother at 42, had done his research. He'd spent weeks at the Pike County Library reading Civil War records, studying maps of Confederate supply routes, interviewing elderly residents who remembered stories their grandparents had told. And he'd become convinced that Raymond Tollett's gold was real. The theft occurred on October 28, 1990. Raymond Tollett had driven to Pikeville for a doctor's appointment. A quarterly check on the black lung, that would eventually kill him. His sons were at work, his property empty. The Brennans had been watching for weeks, learning Raymond's routines, waiting for the perfect opportunity. They knew where the old mine shafts were located on Tollett property from geological survey maps available at the county clerk's office. They didn't know which shaft hid the gold, but they had time and determination. 4 brothers stayed as lookouts while 5 entered Tollett land, spreading out to search every abandoned shaft within a mile of the main house. Patrick Brennan found it at 2:30 in the afternoon, the false wall of stacked stone, the 11 canvas bags hidden behind, $300,000 in gold coins that could buy them new lives far from Pike County's dying economy. They were off the property by 4 o'clock, Raymond Tollett's inherited fortune loaded into the bed of Marcus Brennan's pickup truck, covered with a tarp and firewood. By the time Raymond returned home at 6:15 and discovered the theft, the Brennans were celebrating 40 miles away, already planning how to liquidate the coins through dealers in Cincinnati and Louisville. Raymond Tollett stood in that mine shaft for 20 minutes, staring at the empty space where his family's insurance had been hidden for 125 years. His breathing came shallow and ragged, not from the black lung but from rage so pure it burned through his chest like molten steel. His hands shook, his vision narrowed to a tunnel. When he finally climbed out of the shaft and walked back to his truck, his mind had already made the calculations that would lead to 9 deaths. There were perhaps 15 people in Pike County who knew the gold was real rather than legend. Of those, only 3 had the knowledge and capability to find the mine shaft, navigate Tollett property undetected, and move that much weight quickly. The Brennans had been asking questions about Civil War gold at the library. Patrick Brennan had been seen near Tollett property 2 weeks earlier, supposedly hunting ginseng. And Marcus Brennan had purchased a new truck the day after the theft, paying cash $12,000 for a vehicle he couldn't possibly afford on disability income. Raymond Tollett did not call the police, could not call the police. How would he explain $300,000 in gold coins that had never been reported to the IRS, never appeared on any financial disclosure, existed in a legal gray area between inheritance and hidden treasure? How would he prove ownership of coins minted during the Confederacy and possibly stolen by his ancestor in the first place? The law offered him nothing. But mountain justice, that ancient code that predated courts and lawyers and federal jurisdiction, that code offered a solution. The Brennans had violated sacred rules, entered another man's property, stolen what amounted to his family's only protection against destitution. They had taken food from his grandchildren's mouths, medicine from his dying lungs, the last security blanket that allowed him to sleep at night. And mountain justice said such violations demanded payment in blood. On October 29th, at 7 in the morning, Raymond Tollett called his 4 sons to his house. They sat around the kitchen table where they'd eaten breakfast as children, where their mother had taught them to read, where family decisions had always been made. And Raymond told them what had been stolen and who had stolen it and what they were going to do about it. Jacob Tollett was 44 years old, the oldest son, built thick and strong despite chronic back pain from years operating heavy equipment. He'd served in Vietnam with the 101st Airborne, come home in 1969 with 2 Purple Hearts and a heroin addiction it took him 8 years to break. By 1990, he was clean, working part-time as a mechanic, raising 3 daughters with his wife Linda. He'd spent 20 years trying to leave violence behind, trying to be the kind of father who solved problems with words instead of fists. But when Raymond explained what the Brennans had stolen, Jacob felt something cold settle into his stomach, the same feeling he'd had in Vietnam before an ambush. The certainty that violence was coming whether he wanted it or not. Samuel Tollett was 42, leaner than Jacob but just as strong, with hands that could rebuild an engine or play guitar with equal skill. He'd never left Pike County, never served in the military, never wanted anything except to live quiet in the mountains he loved. He had 2 sons and a daughter, worked construction when work was available, hunted and fished to feed his family when it wasn't. Samuel was the gentle one, the son who'd cried at his mother's funeral while his brothers stood stone-faced. But he understood what the gold meant, understood that without it, his children had no future in a county where opportunity had died with the coal industry. Ezra Tollett was 38, the son who'd inherited Raymond's cold eyes and capacity for violence. He'd done 2 years in federal prison for assault in 1984. Nearly killed a man in a bar fight over an insult Ezra wouldn't even remember now. Since his release in 1986, he'd worked to control the rage that lived just under his skin, worked to be present for his wife Angela and their infant son. But controlling rage didn't mean it disappeared. It just meant Ezra had learned to channel it, save it for moments when violence served a purpose beyond satisfying his own demons. And when Raymond explained that 9 men had stolen their family's only security, Ezra felt the familiar cold clarity settle over him. The same clarity that had terrified other inmates in federal prison, the knowledge that he could do terrible things without hesitation or regret. Benjamin Tollett was 36, the youngest, the son who'd escaped to Lexington for college and come crawling back when he couldn't find work after graduation. He taught part-time at the community college, coached Little League, tried to pretend his sociology degree meant something in a county where education couldn't compete with family connections and economic collapse. He had a daughter, Melissa, 9 years old, bright enough to get out if she had the money for university. The gold would have paid for that education, guaranteed she wouldn't be trapped in Pike County the way her father was trapped. Without it, Melissa would probably end up pregnant at 17, married to some boy with no prospects, repeating the cycle of poverty that ground down every generation. Raymond's proposal was simple, methodical, terrifying in its cold logic. They would find the Brennans, they would recover the gold, and they would eliminate everyone who knew what had been stolen. Because leaving witnesses meant federal prison, and leaving the Brennans alive meant the family would always be looking over their shoulders, always wondering when revenge would come. This wasn't murder, Raymond explained in that quiet voice that made his son's blood run cold. This was pest control, removing threats to the family's survival. The gold was already gone, probably sold to dealers in Cincinnati or hidden somewhere the Tolletts would never find it. But the Brennans knew where it had come from, knew the Tolletts were now vulnerable, knew they could come back for more. The only way to secure the family was to eliminate the threat permanently, completely, with such brutal efficiency that no one else in Pike County would ever consider crossing the Tolletts again. It was the logic of men who'd been pushed past the point where civilization's rules applied. Men for whom the choice was simple, be predator or be prey. Jacob argued. Tried to find another way. Suggested going to the police, hiring a lawyer. Anything except what Raymond proposed, but Raymond asked him one question. What happens to your daughters when I'm dead and the gold is gone and you're facing federal charges for possessing unreported treasure? What future do they have then? And Jacob, who'd killed men in Vietnam and spent 20 years trying to forget, knew his father was right. Samuel argued. Said they could leave, start over somewhere else, rebuild, without blood. But Raymond pointed out that running meant abandoning the land that had been in their family for 6 generations, meant living as fugitives, meant admitting defeat to thieves, and Samuel, who loved these mountains more than he loved his own life, knew his father was right. Ezra didn't argue. Just asked when they were starting and what weapons they'd need. Benjamin argued the hardest, said this would destroy them all, turn them into the kind of men their mother would have been ashamed to know. And Raymond looked at his youngest son with those cold blue eyes and said, Your mother died because we couldn't afford the treatment that might have saved her. Black lung took me before 50. This family has been ground down by poverty and the death of an industry we gave everything to. The Brennans stole our last chance. Are you willing to let your daughter suffer that same fate because you're afraid of being what's necessary? The planning took 3 days. Raymond had served in the Pacific, Jacob in Vietnam, and between them, they possessed enough military knowledge to plan a systematic elimination campaign. They studied topographic maps of Pike County, identified where each Brennan lived, plotted routes that avoided main roads and towns. They inventoried their weapons, hunting rifles mostly, a few handguns, all legally owned and registered. They assigned targets based on capability. Ezra and Jacob would handle the most dangerous Brennans, the ones likely to fight back. Samuel and Benjamin would secure escape routes and handle logistics. Raymond would coordinate from his property, using CB radio to communicate, maintaining plausible deniability in case something went wrong. They set the timeline for November 3rd through 5th, a weekend when most people would be home, when the autumn hunting season meant gunshots in the mountains wouldn't raise suspicion. 3 days to eliminate 9 men and recover what information they could about the gold's current location, assuming any of the Brennans survived long enough to talk. The weapons came from their own collections, accumulated over lifetimes of hunting deer and turkey in Daniel Boone National Forest. Jacob's Winchester Model 70 inches 30-06, the same rifle he'd carried through a dozen hunting seasons. Samuel's Remington 700, accurate to 500 yards. Ezra's Mossberg 500 shotgun, 12 gauge, devastating at close range. Benjamin's Ruger 10/22, quiet enough with subsonic ammunition to kill without alerting neighbors. Raymond's ancient Springfield 1903, the rifle his father had carried in World War I, still functional, still deadly. They bought ammunition at 3 different Walmart stores across 2 counties, paying cash, spreading purchases to avoid pattern recognition. They cleaned weapons until every action was smooth, every chamber perfect. They test-fired in a ravine on Tollett property, confirming 0, practicing rapid target acquisition. And they told themselves this was necessary. This was justice. This was what men did when civilization failed them and family was all that remained. November 3rd arrived cold and clear, temperature at dawn barely 35 degrees. Frost covered everything, turning the world silver-white in the early light. Raymond Tollett stood on his porch at 5:30 in the morning, drinking coffee from a mug his wife had given him 40 years earlier, watching his sons load weapons into their trucks. His black lung made breathing difficult in the cold, each inhalation rasping and painful. But his mind was clear, focused on the next 72 hours. Jacob pulled his truck next to the porch, leaned out the window. "Last chance to stop this, Dad. We can still walk away." Raymond shook his head slowly. "No, we can't. We crossed that line when the Brennans came onto our property, when they took what wasn't theirs. Now, we finish it. How many operations did you run in Vietnam? More than I can count. And how many times did you walk away once the shooting started? Never. Because walking away gets you killed. This is the same. We're committed now. The Brennans made that decision for us when they chose to steal rather than ask for help. And Jacob, who'd spent 20 years trying to leave war behind, nodded once and drove away, understanding that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. Some choices, once made, defined everything that followed. The first target was Marcus Brennan, the oldest brother, the one who'd planned the theft. Intelligence, gathered over 3 days, indicated Marcus lived in a trailer at the Brennan compound, usually home alone on Saturday mornings while his wife worked at the Piggly Wiggly in Pikeville. Jacob and Ezra approached the compound at 7:30 in the morning, parking their truck a mile away and hiking through forest to avoid being seen on the access road. They wore hunting camouflage, nothing unusual for November in Pike County, and carried their rifles in cases that could have held fishing rods. Normal weekend activity, just 2 brothers heading out for a morning hunt. The Brennan compound sat in a clearing surrounded by hardwoods, 3 trailers and 2 shotgun shacks arranged in rough circle around a shared fire pit. Marcus's trailer was the largest, a single wide with rust stains running down the siding and a satellite dish bolted to the roof. A blue pickup truck, the new one Marcus had bought with cash, sat in the driveway. Smoke rose from the chimney. Marcus was home. Jacob positioned himself at the tree line with a clear sight line to the trailer's front door. Ezra circled wide. Approaching from the east, where the trailer's only bedroom window faced a propane tank. They waited, patient, letting the morning develop. At 8:15, Marcus Brennan stepped out onto his porch, coffee mug in hand, wearing sweatpants and a Grateful Dead t-shirt. 42 years old, thick through the middle, bearded, completely unaware that 2 men with rifles were watching him from cover 80 yards away. He stretched, scratched his belly, looked up at the sky, where vultures circled high on thermals. A normal Saturday morning. The last normal morning Marcus Brennan would ever experience. Jacob settled the crosshairs on Marcus's chest, controlled his breathing the way the army had taught him 21 years earlier. His finger rested on the trigger. And then Marcus turned and went back inside. The moment lost. They waited. At 9:03, Marcus emerged again, this time fully dressed, heading toward the new pickup truck. Jacob took him at 40 yards. Single shot through the upper chest, dropping Marcus onto the gravel driveway before he could process what had happened. The sound of the rifle shot echoed once through the hollow, then faded. Jacob and Ezra waited, watching for movement from the other trailers. Nothing. Either no one else was home, or the sound of a gunshot in rural Kentucky during hunting season wasn't enough to raise alarm. They approached carefully, weapons ready. Marcus Brennan lay on his back, eyes open, blood spreading across his Carhartt jacket. Still alive. Barely. Gasping. Looking up at Jacob with comprehension just beginning to form. Jacob stood over him. "Where's the gold?" Marcus's mouth worked, trying to form words. Blood bubbled at his lips. "Cincinnati. Dealer on Vine Street. Sold it. All of it. 200,000. They gave us 200. Jacob nodded, absorbing this information, knowing it didn't matter. The gold was gone, unrecoverable. This had stopped being about recovery when Raymond made the decision to eliminate witnesses rather than negotiate. This was about removing threats and sending messages and becoming the kind of men who could do such things without hesitation. "I'm sorry," Jacob said quietly, then shot Marcus Brennan once more through the head. Thomas Brennan lived in the second trailer, 60 yards from where his brother now lay dead. He was 39, thinner than Marcus, with the weathered look of a man who'd spent his entire life working outdoors. He'd been Marcus's right hand in the theft, the one who'd actually found the mine shaft. Jacob and Ezra waited 10 minutes to see if the gunshots would bring Thomas outside. When he didn't appear, they approached the trailer directly, Ezra moving to the back door while Jacob covered the front. They could hear a television inside, volume high, some morning news program. Jacob tried the front door. Unlocked. He pushed it open slowly, rifle raised. The trailer's interior smelled like cigarette smoke and bacon grease and dirty laundry. Thomas Brennan sat in a recliner, 15 feet away, back to the door, watching television, completely oblivious. Jacob cleared his throat. Thomas turned, saw the rifle, started to stand. "Don't." Jacob's voice was flat, emotionless. Thomas froze halfway out of the chair, hands visible, face showing the rapid calculation of a man realizing he was about to die. "Please, man. Whatever this is about, we can talk. This is about $300,000 in gold coins you stole from my father's property." Thomas's face went pale. "Oh Jesus. Oh Christ, you're Tollett's boy." Marcus said, "You wouldn't find out who did it," Marcus said. Jacob interrupted. "Marcus is dead. Your brother is dead. Now you're going to tell me where the gold is, and then I'm going to decide what happens next." Thomas talked fast, words tumbling over themselves, desperate to live another few minutes. Told Jacob about the dealer in Cincinnati. A man named Sheldon who specialized in antique coins, no questions asked. Told him they'd only gotten 200,000 because Sheldon took a 30% cut on untraceable gold. Told him the money was split 9 ways, each Brennan getting 22,000, already spent on trucks and trailers and paying off debts. Told him everything Jacob already knew or suspected. And when Thomas finished talking, he looked up at Jacob with desperate hope. "I told you everything. We're square now. Right? We can make this right. I'll pay you back. I'll work for you. Whatever you need." Jacob stared at this man who'd helped destroy his family's security. This man who'd violated the most fundamental rule of mountain culture. This man who thought words could erase actions. "I have daughters," Jacob said quietly. 3 girls who might have gone to college on that gold, who might have escaped this county and built real lives. You took that from them. From my family. There's no making this right. The rifle came up. Thomas lunged sideways. Trying to reach a pistol Jacob could now see on the side table. Never made it. Jacob's shot took him in the side, spinning him around. The second shot finished it. 2 dead. 7 to go. By noon on November 3rd, the Tollett brothers had eliminated 4 of the 9 Brennans. Patrick, found in his shanty behind the main compound, shot while trying to load a shotgun. Liam, found working on a truck engine, killed before he could reach tools that might have served as weapons. The pattern was simple, methodical, overwhelming. The Tolletts had military training, surprise, and the cold determination of men who'd accepted that they were crossing into darkness and decided the price was worth paying. The Brennans had numbers but no warning, no preparation, no understanding that death was coming until it arrived. By afternoon, word had begun to spread through the Brennan family that something was wrong. Declan Brennan, calling his brother Marcus's phone repeatedly with no answer. Robert Brennan, driving to the compound to check on family and finding it strangely quiet. 2 trucks in driveways, but no movement. No response to shouts. Smart enough not to enter trailers. Smart enough to get back in his vehicle and drive away fast. Calling the other surviving Brennans to warn them. The Pike County Sheriff's Department received the first call at 2:47 in the afternoon. Dispatcher, taking a report from Robert Brennan, hysterical, saying something was wrong at the family compound, saying his brothers weren't answering their phones, saying he'd seen what looked like blood on gravel near Marcus's trailer. The sheriff, Harold Combs, 58 years old and 3 months from retirement, sent 2 deputies to investigate. They arrived at 3:15, found Marcus's body immediately, then discovered Thomas, Patrick, and Liam in quick succession. By 3:30, the compound was declared a crime scene. By 4 o'clock, Kentucky State Police had been called. By 5, the FBI field office in Lexington had been notified that a mass murder had occurred in Pike County. But the Tollett brothers were already gone, vanished into the Daniel Boone National Forest where they'd hunted since childhood, where they knew every trail and ridge and hollow, where law enforcement would need days to search effectively. And the remaining 5 Brennans, Robert, Kevin, Sean, Michael, and Declan, were running, scattering across eastern Kentucky, trying to reach safety before whoever had executed their family found them too. The manhunt began at dawn on November 4th. Kentucky State Police, FBI agents, Pike County Sheriff's deputies, and U.S. Forest Service law enforcement, over 60 officers total, spreading across the Daniel Boone National Forest in the largest search operation in eastern Kentucky history. Helicopters with thermal imaging swept ridgelines. K-9 units tracked scent trails through hollows. Roadblocks controlled every paved road in a 20-mile radius, but the Tolletts weren't running. They were hunting. Raymond had planned for pursuit, identified safe houses owned by extended family members, stockpiled supplies in abandoned mine shafts and caves throughout the national forest. His sons moved like ghosts, through terrain they'd known since childhood, avoiding law enforcement with almost contemptuous ease, continuing their systematic elimination of the remaining Brennans. Kevin Brennan died on November 4th at 11 in the morning, ambushed while trying to reach his cousin's house in Letcher County. Single shot from 300 yards, clean kill, body not discovered until evening. Sean Brennan died that same afternoon. Caught at a gas station in Pikeville. Shot in the parking lot in broad daylight. The shooter vanishing into traffic before witnesses could even call police. By the morning of November 5th, 3 Brennans remained alive. Robert, Michael, and Declan, hiding in a hunting cabin 20 miles from the original compound, armed with shotguns and pistols, terrified, knowing they were being hunted but helpless to stop it. They'd tried calling police, but what could they say? "We stole gold from a man who's now killing us for it. And by the way, we can't return the gold, because we already sold it and spent the money." They were criminals confessing to theft while begging for protection from consequences. The police were searching for the killers, but slowly, methodically, constrained by procedure and jurisdiction and the sheer scale of the search area. The Tolletts were operating under no constraints except the need to finish what they'd started. Samuel Tollett found the hunting cabin at 2 in the afternoon, identified it through a combination of informants and knowledge of where Brennan family friends owned property. He radioed Jacob and Ezra. 1 hour later, all 3 Tollett brothers were positioned around the cabin, waiting for dark. The assault began at 7:30 in the evening. Benjamin, the reluctant son, the one who'd argued against this entire operation, was back at Raymond's property, maintaining communications, serving as alibi's coordinator, the role Raymond had assigned him when it became clear Benjamin couldn't participate directly in killing. So, it was Jacob, Samuel, and Ezra who surrounded that cabin in full darkness, who cut the phone line, who positioned themselves at doors and windows with the cold efficiency of men who'd done this before or wished they hadn't. Ezra called out from the tree line, "Robert Brennan, Michael, Declan, you're surrounded. Come out with your hands visible." No response from inside the cabin. Just silence and the smell of fear that seemed to carry on the November wind. "You stole from my father, killed my family's future. Now you pay the debt." Still nothing. Then the cabin's front door opened, and Robert Brennan appeared, shotgun raised. Opened fire toward the sound of Ezra's voice, 12-gauge thunder shattering the night. But Ezra had moved after calling out, now positioned 20 yards from where his voice had originated. Old trick. He returned fire. Robert fell. The battle for the cabin lasted 11 minutes. Michael and Declan, trapped inside, fired through windows at muzzle flashes, hit nothing but trees. The Tollett brothers, positioned in darkness with good cover and superior training, picked their shots carefully. Samuel put rounds through the cabin's thin walls, forcing the Brennans to stay low, limiting their mobility. Jacob circled wide, found the back door, kicked it in, while attention was focused elsewhere. Entered shooting. Michael died in the cabin's kitchen, caught crossing from bedroom to living room. Declan made it almost to the back door, almost to escape, before Samuel's rifle ended him, and then it was over. 9 Brennans dead in 3 days. The systematic elimination of an entire family because they'd violated codes older than American law, because they'd stolen from the wrong family in a place where theft of livelihood was still, in some minds, a capital offense. Jacob, Samuel, and Ezra stood in that cabin, surrounded by bodies and spent brass and the smell of gunpowder and blood, and knew they'd crossed into territory from which there was no return. They'd become exactly what the mountains sometimes made of: desperate men, killers, criminals, the kind of people they'd been raised to fear and avoid. But Raymond had been right about one thing. They'd protected the family, eliminated the threat, sent a message that would echo through Pike County for decades. No one would cross the Tolletts again. The price had been their souls. But they'd secured their children's futures, or at least removed one obstacle to those futures. They left the cabin without speaking, moved through darkness to where they'd hidden their vehicles, drove separate routes back to Raymond's property. Behind them, 3 more bodies waited for discovery by law enforcement, still searching miles away. The Appalachian Massacre of 1990, that's what newspapers would call it later, was complete. Kentucky State Police found the hunting cabin at 9:30 the next morning, November 6th. FBI Special Agent Victoria Cross arrived on scene by noon. Took one look at the systematic nature of the kills, the coordinated assault pattern, the military-style execution, and knew immediately this wasn't random violence. This was planned elimination carried out by people with training and resources and specific motive. By evening, investigators had connected the cabin murders to the compound killings. By the following morning, they'd identified the victims as members of the Brennan family, and by November 8th, they'd developed a working theory. The Brennans had stolen something valuable from someone capable of this level of retribution. Question was, what had been stolen and from whom? The answer came from an unexpected source. Declan Brennan's widow, who told investigators her husband had been terrified the last days of his life, kept saying something about gold and the Tolletts and how they'd made a terrible mistake. The investigation focused on Raymond Tollett and his 4 sons immediately. FBI agents interviewed neighbors, examined financial records, searched property with warrants based on Declan's widow's statement. They found nothing concrete, The mine shaft, where gold had been hidden, was empty, had clearly been empty for months, based on dust patterns and lack of recent disturbance. No gold coins appeared in any Tollett bank account or property. No witnesses could place any Tollett near any murder scene. The weapons used in the killings were common hunting rifles and shotguns, impossible to trace definitively. And every Tollett had alibis provided by extended family members who swore under oath that Jacob, Samuel, Ezra, and Benjamin had been working on Raymond's property the entire weekend, repairing fences and clearing brush, and engaging in normal family activities. The alibis were obviously fabricated, but proving it was impossible without physical evidence or witness testimony, neither of which materialized. The case went cold by January 1991. Federal prosecutors couldn't build charges without evidence. No murder weapons recovered. No witnesses to any killing. No financial motive they could prove in court because the gold's existence was itself questionable, based only on family rumors and Declan Brennan's frightened comments to his wife. The FBI suspected the Tolletts, strongly suspected them, but suspicion wasn't enough for indictment. Pike County settled into uneasy silence. Everyone knew what had happened. Everyone understood the Brennans had stolen something and paid the ultimate price. But knowledge wasn't proof. And mountain culture, which valued settling debts privately over involving outside authority, meant no one was coming forward with information even if they had it. The Tolletts had committed perfect crimes. Not because they were brilliant criminals, but because they'd operated within a culture that protected its own and understood that sometimes violent justice was the only justice available to poor people in forgotten places. Raymond Tollett died in March 1995 at age 77. Black lung finally claiming him. He went to his grave having never spoken publicly about the gold or the Brennans or that November weekend in 1990. Whatever guilt or satisfaction he felt remained locked behind those cold blue eyes until they closed forever. He was buried next to Sarah in the small cemetery behind Truevine Baptist Church, the same church where he'd been married in 1941, where he'd baptized his sons, where he'd carried his wife's coffin. At the funeral, his 4 sons stood stone-faced and silent, while the preacher talked about Raymond's long life and hard work and devotion to family. No one mentioned the 9 men whose deaths had secured that family's survival. No one needed to. Everyone understood. Jacob Tollett lived until 2008, dying of heart attack at 62 while working in his garage. He'd never spoken about November 1990. Never confessed, never sought forgiveness or offered justification. But his daughter Emily later told a journalist that her father had woken screaming from nightmares 2 or 3 times a week for the last 18 years of his life, that he'd started drinking heavily in his 50s, that he'd told her once, while drunk, that a man could do necessary things and still be destroyed by having done them. Emily used the money Jacob left her to attend University of Kentucky, graduated with honors in 2010, became a social worker helping families in Appalachian, Kentucky navigate poverty and addiction. She never married, never had children, carried her father's choices like weight that could never be set down. Samuel Tollett is still alive at 72, living in the same house where he was raised, working part-time at a hardware store in Pikeville. He rarely speaks, keeps to himself, attends church every Sunday where he sits alone in the back pew. His children left Pike County years ago, wanted nothing to do with the mountains or the family history that haunted them. Samuel walks with a cane now, black lung taking him the same way it took his father, slow and painful and inevitable. In a rare 2015 interview, he said only, "We did what we thought we had to do. Doesn't mean it was right. Just means we couldn't see another way at the time." Ezra Tollett died in prison in 2003, serving 20 years for killing a man in a bar fight unrelated to the Brennan murders. Whatever capacity for violence he'd unleashed in November 1990 apparently never went back to sleep. He was 51 when a fight over a pool game ended with another man dead and Ezra back in federal custody. He died of complications from hepatitis C at 58, alone in a prison hospital, never having granted interviews about 1990, never having confirmed or denied anything. Prison records show he was a difficult inmate, frequently in solitary confinement, feared by other prisoners for his cold capacity for violence. One cellmate told authorities that Ezra sometimes talked in his sleep, numbers mostly, counting 1 through 9 over and over. Benjamin Tollett left Pike County in 1993, moved to Asheville, North Carolina, changed his last name to his mother's maiden name, Mackenzie. He works as a guidance counselor at a public high school, helps teenagers navigate college applications and scholarship opportunities. His daughter Melissa graduated from Chapel Hill in 2005, became a lawyer, lives in Charlotte, has children of her own who know nothing about their great-grandfather or what happened in November 1990. Benjamin hasn't returned to Pike County in 32 years. In an anonymous letter to the FBI in 2010, he wrote, "I was there, but I didn't pull any trigger. I coordinated communications and provided alibis. Does that make me less guilty? More guilty? I don't know anymore. I just know I can't undo it. Can't bring 9 men back to life. Can't erase what my family became." The Brennan family, survivors, wives, children, siblings, scattered after 1990. Some stayed in Kentucky. Most left, unable to bear living where their family had been hunted down and eliminated. They received no justice, no closure, no acknowledgement that what happened to their loved ones was anything except the inevitable consequence of stealing from the wrong people. In 2010, Marcus Brennan's daughter Jennifer organized a memorial service for the 9 murdered men, held at a small church in Pikeville. 11 people attended. No media coverage, no recognition from law enforcement, just quiet grief and the understanding that her father and uncles had made fatal choices and paid prices far exceeding the crime. Jennifer told a documentary filmmaker in 2018 that she'd spent years trying to understand how gold coins could matter more than human lives, how poverty and desperation could turn ordinary people into killers and thieves, how economic collapse destroyed not just communities, but the moral frameworks that held those communities together. She had no answers, just questions that would haunt her until she died. The gold itself was never recovered. The dealer in Cincinnati, Sheldon, had sold the coins to collectors within days of purchasing them from the Brennans, dispersed them into the numismatic market where they became untraceable. The Brennans had spent their shares on trucks and trailers and debt relief, temporary solutions to permanent poverty, nothing that lasted or mattered. The Tolletts had their revenge, but not their inheritance. 9 men died over $300,000 that benefited no one, solved nothing, left only corpses and traumatized families and questions about justice and morality that had no satisfying answers. The FBI officially closed the investigation in 2000, marked the case unsolved but inactive, acknowledged they'd probably never develop evidence sufficient for prosecution. Pike County moved on the way communities do after violence, covering scars with layers of normalcy until they almost disappeared. Today, Raymond Tollett's property sits abandoned, house collapsed, outbuildings falling to ruin, reclaimed by forest. No one wanted to buy land with that history, that weight. The mine shaft, where gold was hidden, has been sealed by the Forest Service, deemed unsafe, forgotten. The Brennan compound was demolished in 1995. The land sold to a developer who built nothing, just let it grow over with kudzu and saplings. There are no historical markers, no memorials, no acknowledgement that the worst systematic manhunt in modern Appalachian history occurred in Pike County in November 1990. The town just moved forward, the way towns do, carrying trauma that's never spoken about, but never fully forgotten either. Children play in forests where men once hunted each other. Families live in trailers near where blood once soaked the ground. Life continues, relentless and forgetful, almost. The Appalachian Massacre of 1990 became legend in eastern Kentucky, a cautionary tale whispered in bars and churches, a reminder of what happens when poverty and desperation and wounded pride collide in places where the law is 40 miles away and mountain justice still carries weight. It's the story parents tell children, sometimes, when those children ask why their family left Pike County, why they don't visit the mountains anymore, why certain names can't be mentioned around certain relatives. And it's the question that haunts everyone who hears the full story. Where exactly is the line between protecting your family and destroying your soul? Between justice and vengeance? Between necessary evil and unforgivable sin? The Tolletts crossed that line, did monstrous things to people who'd wronged them, secured their family's future by destroying 9 others. Were they heroes protecting their own? Were they villains who murdered men over money? Or were they simply desperate people pushed past the point where civilization's rules applied, acting according to older, darker codes born from centuries of survival in hard places? There are no easy answers, no satisfying moral conclusions. Just the simple and terrible truth that violence breeds violence, that stolen gold creates chains of tragedy extending far beyond the original theft, that poverty makes people desperate enough to steal and desperate enough to kill. That mountain justice, that ancient code, still exists in forgotten corners of America, where the law offers little protection and family is all that matters. And that sometimes, ordinary people become monsters not because they're inherently evil, but because circumstances push them past the point where good choices exist. Raymond Tollett and his sons killed 9 men. 9 men who'd stolen from them, yes, but 9 men nonetheless. 9 futures erased, 9 families destroyed. And for what? Revenge that didn't return the gold. Security that required becoming the kind of people who could execute systematic murder. A legacy of blood that would haunt the Tollett children for generations. The Appalachian Massacre of 1990 asks uncomfortable questions about justice and morality and the price we pay when systems fail. It asks whether there are circumstances where violence becomes not just understandable but necessary. Whether family loyalty can justify murder, whether poverty excuses theft, and whether theft justifies execution. It asks where we draw the line between protecting what's ours and destroying what's theirs. And it refuses to offer easy answers, because easy answers don't exist. Only hard questions, and the bodies of 9 men who made fatal choices, and 5 men who made choices that destroyed them in different ways. Only children who grew up without fathers on both sides of the tragedy. Only communities that carry scars from violence they couldn't prevent, or explain or reconcile with their understanding of right and wrong. If this story made you think about desperation, justice, and the darkness that lives in all of us when we're pushed far enough, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe for more true stories from forgotten America, where poverty and pride and violence collide in ways we prefer not to acknowledge. Comment below. What would you have done in Raymond Tollett's place? Where do you draw the line between protecting your family and becoming a monster? How far would you go if everything you'd worked for your entire life was stolen and the law offered no recourse? Because these questions aren't just academic exercises. They're real dilemmas faced by real people in places where opportunity died and desperation remains. Places where the choice between predator and prey feels more immediate than the choice between right and wrong. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying monsters aren't born evil. They're ordinary people who convince themselves that terrible actions serve necessary purposes. One stolen fortune, one calculated decision. One November weekend at a time.